All right. I'll hand it off to Arca and Bridget. Thanks again for being here, guys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
honor.
Thanks everyone for having us. Um, Bridget and I were first talking about doing this presentation today, we were talking about how to distill a 4-hour workshop down into about an hour. Um, and so uh, we probably are gonna, I was just telling Amy, we're probably gonna just kind of power through and then hopefully have some time at the end for some conversation, reflection, and discussion. But before we start, what I always like to ask folks to do in these types of sessions is for us to get out of our cerebral minds and get more into our heart and soul. And to really listen with an open mind. And when you feel, because you will feel, I feel it myself as I when I'm teaching. When you feel that defensiveness start to creep up, or you feel that shame and guilt start to fill up as we're going through some concepts, to acknowledge it and please release it. Um, this work is anti-oppression work, is work that all of us have to engage in, regardless of our race, ethnicity, other cultural factors, and in spite or including our location in terms of not just geographic location, but our location within academia. So in this type of work, I really think about us as all being one. Bridget, anything you want to add before I start to share?
Yeah, I think one thing just to keep in mind is so much of what Arika and I like to do together is the modeling of the thing itself. And the time restraint makes that really hard. Um, and so it's just to say we're going to present this in a much more didactic format than we would ever. And that doesn't give as much space for something that we really hold very closely, which is that like we are all expert in our own experience in this, and there's a lot of expertise in this room. And as educators, right, that's such an important guiding principle when we bring groups of learners together, right? That the job is a real dance between giving information and facilitating experiences where people can reflect on what they know, reflect on what they assume, and shift and integrate. So we're not going to get to model that in the ideal way today, but the spirit of that is with us, and part of what we will talk about when we think about like specifically practices for education and educational spaces. Let's go.
Let's go. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works well. Let me know if you are not able to see the screen. We'll go ahead and get started. So we're just starting with disclosures. We have no financial disclosures. Want to talk really quick just about our session overview, which is really the importance of centering anti-oppression work and paradigms as educators. We're going to review some foundational concepts and theoretical frameworks. And then we're going to talk some about how do we sustain ourselves in this work, because this work is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for all of us. It's uncomfortable for me. It's right. Like, so how do we sustain ourselves for the long haul? Because this work really is long term, lifelong work. It's not a checkbox and it's not one and done. So we always start off in any teaching that we do together with a land acknowledgement. And we want to acknowledge that, or I want to acknowledge that I'm a Black cisgender woman who's presenting to you today from Seattle, the Seattle area, on the traditional land of the Coast Salish people, specifically the land of the Duwamish people. The Coast Salish people are still here. They're resilient and they're strong, and they're continuing to carry on the history and traditions of their ancestors. And I honor them and the land upon which I live and work. And Bridget?
Where's my text? I should have this land acknowledgement memorized, and I don't. um, I am coming to you today from the San Francisco Bay Area, which is the land of the Ramaytush Ohlone. And I think the thing that I will say about this land acknowledgement piece that's important to me is that I pay a land tax. And so the honoring is in the words, but for me, the honoring is in the action, that I pay rent because I'm on land that is not my own, to support the communities and the work whose land it is.
Thank you, Bridget. So we want to encourage all of us to think about, honor, and acknowledge the first people of the land upon which we live and work, and consider ways that you can support beyond just doing a land acknowledgement. And Bridget spoke very nicely to one of the ways that we can do that through, land back movement and paying real rent. One of the things that is important to acknowledge is that land acknowledgements are important, and being cognizant that we must do more than just acknowledge whose land we are on. That's equally as important. Land acknowledgements have to be more than just a checkbox at the beginning of a presentation. We see this so often in academic presentations nowadays of, a really quick land acknowledgement that they talk through very, very quickly and then move on to what is seen as the substance of the presentation. And in this work, this is a big part of the substance of the presentation. We love this quote by the grandmother Mary Lyons, who is of the Leech Lake Band of the Ojibwe people. And she says, when we talk about land, land is part of who we are. It's a mixture of our blood, our past, our current, and our future. We carry our ancestors in us, and they're around us, as you all do. And Bridget dropped into the chat just the link for you to go and see who are the first people of the land upon which you live and work. And if you feel like you want to share it in chat, please go ahead and do so. We won't stop, pause, and go through them, but it'd be great just for folks to be able to see where each other are coming from.
I'll just say, I feel like land acknowledgements are actually like an awesome example of how we actually practice anti-oppression, or how we enact anti-oppression practice, which is for those of us in liberal organizations, right? Like, land acknowledgements are not just things that happen, but why? And what do they actually mean? And can we pause and take time to build, especially as white folks, authentic relationships to this practice, especially if we're going to participate? I think for me, my sense is it's better not to participate until we understand really personally why. Why is this important to me? Is it important to me? If it's not, what is the barrier there, right? So as exercises that symbolize sort of DEI or JEDI become more integrated into just what we do, can we slow down and pause and say, why are we doing this? What does it actually mean to enact this? And how can I build more depth and authenticity in my relationship to the things that are now just a part of what we do, be it a land acknowledgement or a DEI slide before your talk at AHPM, right? Like, can we slow down and question what we're doing and why?
It's such an important point, Bridget, because this anti-oppression work it cannot be rushed. Because if it is rushed, it can really start to feel like it's just virtue signaling. Just want to quickly, there's this great article in Outside Magazine that was written by Dr. Lynn Nessifer, who is an Indigenous scholar. And he talks about why we need to reframe how we do land acknowledgements. And then he also posted on his social media. I find this cartoon amusing, just because it really I think sums up for me what I'm seeing happen across academic organizations, right? Like, let's do a land acknowledgement. And the Indigenous person says, okay, and then goes up on stage and says, give the land back. Efforts. We also always do a labor acknowledgement because we live and work on land that was stolen and colonized by a system of white supremacy. Many aspects of this system were built on the backs of enslaved black bodies whose progeny still have not been compensated for the stolen labor of their ancestors. We have to acknowledge that we are the benefactors of the uncompensated and undercompensated labor of quote unquote undocumented people, caregivers, including those
Welcome
who
to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID,
including those who care for the children and elders in our society, and the labor of many other historically marginalized people. And this labor, whether it's emotional, physical, mental, or spiritual, that we all benefit from, is often, again, on the unacknowledged labor of Black, Brown, and other people of color bodies. And I just want to say really quickly that being documented or quote unquote legal is a tool of a system of white supremacy that drew borders and continues to maintain borders that barred people who historically moved freely as needed for cultural and other reasons, including survival. So when we talk about white supremacy, and we're going to talk about it a lot in this talk, you'll hear us use the words white supremacy quite a bit. We're not talking about individual people. We're not talking about individual white supremacists. We are talking about a system that was intentionally created to extol some while subverting others. All right, so we wanted to start us off with really talking about what are the North Stars that we're thinking about in this work, right? And we named it a little bit earlier, the willingness to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, being honest about your discomfort, but not allowing it to hinder you from growth. Pausing before speaking, note the reactions that you're having, that your body is having. So taking a breath before responding and speaking your truth. So not speaking for all people, but speaking your own truth. I feel, or I am, or that. And then along with that is, of course, starting with ourselves as individuals, as palliative care educators. How have we been complicit in systems of oppression? And that can be a hard truth for any of us, is to think about how we have been complicit in systems of oppression. And the healthcare system is, unfortunately, is a system of oppression.
And when we
Bridget?
think about, well, I'm just thinking about these North Stars and how these are all like really important community guidelines for educational spaces, right? And whether we're speaking to them explicitly and adding to them, or we are just very aware and intentional that these are the types of spaces that we want to create when we're teaching and learning and in that exchange, right? In order to really do that and challenge hierarchy and challenge who generally gets to take up space and who doesn't, right? These are really central components to learning spaces. I think one thing that I would add here that Arka and I have talked about a lot of times is there's this tendency in anti-oppression work or anti-racist work, especially for us white folks, to think that we're doing this work on behalf of other people. And so much I think a really important working assumption of mine is that this work is towards the liberation of all of us, that we are looking to see and dismantle and challenge systems that none of us created. All of us inherited them. They're much older than us. We all participate in their continuation, and we all have the opportunity to take them apart towards our fuller humanness, regardless of our background. To take away the kind of white savior thing that we do a lot of the time, or this kind of like one directional, like it's my job to do this for you, as opposed to this idea that this is really a relational and sort of all of us effort, because we are all harmed by these systems. To that point, we think a lot about spaces, and we think hard about the language for the types of spaces we're creating. And language is such an important tool in this space, not to be sort of the police or policing of other people's language, but rather to be really intentional around what it is we mean, and to slow down and not communicate something sort of unintentionally that we don't mean. And we really land on this idea of accountable space, which means bringing responsibility for yourself. You'll hear echoes of other things we've said. Your intentions, words, and actions. It means entering a space with good intentions, but understanding and aligning your intent with action is a true test of commitment to this work. And we're really intentionally not using brave space, and we're not using safe space. We have spent, all of us probably have been involved, but academia has spent a lot of time talking about safety. And the reality is, to be in this discussion where we're taking apart and challenging and trying to bring light to these systems that are just in the water, it's not comfortable. And at times we may not feel safe, right? So what's the thing we can actually work towards? We can work towards accountability and responsibility and curiosity around other people's experience of ourselves and experience in systems. So this is a great resource just for thinking about safe versus brave versus accountable spaces. And you may want to, you'll have the slides, look at this more closely so you can think about the kinds of spaces you're creating when you're teaching. So why are we here? Bell Hooks, I think, may be one of the greatest teachers around sort of liberatory education. And, she really thinks about education as a practice of freedom. And hold on, I am like really struggling with my technology today. Okay. So she says so many things. And if you have the opportunity to ever read Teaching to Transgress, it is an amazing doctrine on teaching as a liberatory practice. But she says the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy, and that education was about the practice of freedom. And that's why we're here today, because you are educators, and here is an opportunity to integrate anti-oppression framework into every way that you show up as educators. Bell Hooks is was such a foundational teacher around location and positionality and intersectionality, and how we understand the role of our own experience, and how that informs how how information is transmissed through us, right? So this real rich opportunity to think about, who am I as a white, queer, cisgendered woman showing up to educational spaces? What do I represent? What power do I have? What platform do I have? What might my presence mean to somebody else? And how does that inform a teaching and learning relationship? On the other side, how can I be curious about the people that I am teaching, that I am responsible to as mentees, be it momentary mentees or long-term mentees? Erica, are you doing this? Am I doing this? Me? Oh, cool. One day, I know we've all been doing everything on Zoom for many years, but one day I will be one of those people that has like, I even have two screens in front of me. Like I can have my notes and have you, instead of doing this like crazy toggling or this wild toggling on a very small screen in front of me. So More Genesis, which is Arica's consulting company, the ethical mandate for anti-oppression work. It's ethically imperative to address how oppression shows up on our teams, in our classrooms, and in educational settings and the systems within we work. If we don't step into this conversation explicitly, we're complicit with systems of oppression. So I feel like this is real, we're sitting here as an interprofessional group of palliative care educators. And this is like a tiny, tiny, tiny opportunity to practice this. But when we step into positions, education positions, who is up there teaching with us? If we're physicians, are there other professions there? If we're white, are there folks of color, right? Like who gets to teach? And who gets to teach what? And who is paid to teach what? Right? These are really like basic questions, basic like logistical and practical questions that over time you see, right? Like there aren't social workers being paid to help run the educational offerings of fellowships often, right? Like whose labor is expected to be free. And you can assess that on lines of race, on gender lines, on the ways professions are feminized or not, right? This is the kind of analysis we want to bring just to like, before we're even in the room teaching, who's teaching with us, who's asked to teach, who's paid to teach, whose expertise are we centering? Asking those questions as we're creating curriculum, as we're creating educational experiences is how we start to enact this practice together with one another interprofessionally.
So before I move on to the next slide, I'm going to just give a little bit of we often talk about trigger warnings, and it's just a trigger warning that there are some images on this next slide that may be that may trigger real deep discomfort. And I put the slide together, and I can tell you there's an image on here that really makes me incredibly uncomfortable. And we really want it for us to think about some definitions and some foundational concepts. And so these definitions that I'm going to be talking with you about right now are definitions that come from the National Center for Cultural Competence at Georgetown University. I always kind of chuckle a little bit because I personally don't think about it in terms of competence, because I don't believe that we can ever truly be competent in anti-oppression work. And anti-oppression work includes acknowledging our implicit and our explicit biases. So according to the National Center for Cultural Competence, implicit bias operates outside of our awareness. It can be in a direct contradiction to our espoused beliefs and values. It automatically seeps into our affect or our behavior and is outside of the full awareness of each of us. Implicit bias can interfere with clinical assessment, with educating, with decision making, with provider patient relationships, such that the goals that the provider and the patient are seeking are compromised. And they define explicit bias as that we're very clear about our feelings and attitudes about something, including our behaviors. And these are conducted with intent. They're processed neurologically at a conscious level as declarative, semantic memory, and in words. In its extreme, it's characterized by overt negative behavior that can be expressed through physical and verbal harassment or through more subtle means such as exclusion. And so when we look at the imagery that is on this slide, it's there's both the implicit, the tweet or Instagram, I don't remember where Snoop Dogg put this out, but being mindful about stereotypes and picture of him and Martha Stewart, and only one of them is a convicted felon. And by the way, it's not Snoop Dogg, right? To the insurrection on January 6th, to the more explicit racism of the of white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. So I want to talk about just some more definitions, some more foundational concepts. And I often say that culture is vast and broad, and it's as unique as each of us is. So when we're talking about cultural humility and responsiveness, which is the language that we use instead of competence, that they jointly are the ability to see and authentically accept another who is different from ourselves, acceptance of differences that may include race and ethnicity, gender identity, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, neurodiversity, how one physically, emotionally, and spiritually navigates the world, and so many more variables. We often think about cultural humility as being the noun, right? It allows us to remain open to these differences despite ingrained societal influences that may implicitly or explicitly encourage otherwise. And cultural responsiveness is the verb. It's how we respond to these differences, right? Do we respond with openness and humility and awareness, or at the very least, an understanding that biases exist in each of us? Acting with cultural humility and responsiveness means that one has an awareness that we are never truly a cultural, quote, expert, unquote. That remaining culturally humble and responsive requires continuous growth, learning, and discomfort. And I think that's the piece that as human beings that we try to push away from, right? Is the discomfort. What can I do to make myself more comfortable in this space, in this conversation? What do I do if a student is challenging me on something that I believe or know to be the truth? Maybe something that I've been teaching for, years and years and years, and then it's challenged. And then we also want to talk about decolonization, because part of what we believe in as educators is how do we decolonize systems? So we define decolonization as intentional actions to dismantle the systems of colonization and white supremacy in all aspects of society, including medicine and healthcare and education and academia. And this involves an intentional deconstruction of, and at times completely dismantling the policies, procedures, and colonizing practices and thinking that are deeply entrenched in these systems. Sometimes so deeply entrenched that we're not aware, right? Again, it's implicit in who we are. So to decolonize requires deep personal reflection and intentional movement within static systems that are designed to protect themselves. It requires identifying and eradicating white supremacy where it is implicitly and explicitly wielded to maintain systems of oppression that are not inclusive of the values, beliefs, mores, rituals, and ways of being that historically excluded and marginalized people and communities value, right? It's dismissing something because there's not the data to go along with it, or because somebody hasn't completed a study. And I think oftentimes about kind of more what we call naturopathic types of medicine, and if a patient or a family comes to us and they say that they want to utilize a specific type of herb or something like that, and we immediately dismiss it because it hasn't been shown to provide any type of benefit, right? As an example. So we keep talking about the discomfort piece, and decolonization requires discomfort. It requires a deep personal analysis of how each of us has been socialized and entrenched in a system of racism, many other isms, and white supremacy. It requires acknowledgement that we uphold these oppressive systems, often unintentionally, just by being socialized within an overall system that upholds the values of colonization and white supremacy. And I know, like in this definition, we talk about colonization, we talk about white supremacy a lot, but that's really, again, the foundation upon which this country was built by um, colonizers who came from other lands, and destroyed the amazing ecosystem that existed long before us.
Thinking, like, before we move on to the next slide, like, how humbling this idea of decolonizing actually is when it comes to putting it in practice, and something that as an educator, I think a lot about when I go out there to like spread the good word of palliative care, is the need to pause to think about how palliative care itself participates in this system, and potentially what work we need to do to decolonize palliative care, i.e., to challenge, and we'll talk about whiteness in a second, but to challenge the basic values and beliefs of palliative care that actually are duplicating white value systems, right? And so I say that just to note that, like, we all still have to do our jobs, and we exist in this system, and we exist within palliative care, and like, you know, it's not like we have to just like take the whole thing apart before we can do any work, but we have to be doing these things simultaneously. So when we get up there and we're teaching about advanced care planning, and we're like really, you know, going hard on the importance of anticipatory planning and anticipatory decision making, that we start to slow down in our prep times and think about, like, for who anticipates future decision making, who thinks about dying, who thinks that's comforting, right? And it's not like Black people don't and white people do, right? It's never that simple. But when we're thinking about what cultural systems we are representing and promoting as central and dominant, most likely they reflect whiteness on some level. So what is whiteness? Whiteness and white racialized identity refer to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as a standard by which all other groups are compared. Whiteness is also at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity throughout America's history have created a culture where non-white people are seen as inferior or abnormal. This white dominant culture also operates as social mechanisms that grants advantages to white people, since they can navigate society both by feeling normal and by being viewed as normal. Persons who identify as white rarely have to think about their racial identity because they live within a culture where whiteness has been normalized. There is a ton of choice if you are a white person. Thinking about race is very different for non-white people living in America. People of color must always consider their racial identity, whatever the situation, due to the systemic and interpersonal racism that exists. Whiteness and its accepted normalcy and superiority also exists as everyday and through everyday microaggressions towards people of color. Acts of microaggressions include verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults towards non-white folks. Whether intentional or not, these attitudes communicate hostile, derogatory, or harmful messages. It's really, really central. And again, to this discomfort part, we are proliferating whiteness at times in palliative care. And I think of folks in medicine, we are the best positioned to challenge that, because our mandate to take care of people where they are in the context of their life, right? Like, we have all of the values to help us do it differently. And we're kind of in the generation of palliative care educators and providers, because I would guess most of us are kind of in the like 2.0 palliative care generation, where we inherited this and we have the opportunity and just that little bit of space to say, like, hey, why this way? Why do we talk about things so explicitly with everyone? How can we adjust that? And I'm sure you all do that in your practices, right? There's lots of nuance when it comes to how we practice one-on-one with individuals and with families. But when we talk about palliative care, we tend to talk about it in much more blanket terms. So how can we bring that same nuance to our bigger discussion around palliative care, what it is and what it's meant to do? So white supremacy, this, white supremacy is really, really activating pair of words. And generally for white folks, it's kind of like, yeah, not me, other people. But if we think of whiteness as sort of like the centered and elevated or pedestaled sort of set of norms in American culture, white supremacy culture is described in these ways. And I just want you to sort of let these concepts kind of like wash over you. But some ways that white supremacy culture is expressed is in this idea of perfectionism. You're going to hear a lot of things that reflect medicine, and it's not to say medicine is bad. It's also not to say that these qualities are inherently bad, right? It's to say that these are qualities that are centered and prioritized when it comes to whiteness and white supremacy. Perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, paternalism, either or black and white thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, progress means bigger and more, objectivity, and the right to comfort. And we made bigger some of the ones that stand out to us as like really a big component of some of the stuff that we deal with and do every day in palliative care and by being in medicine, right? Again, it's not to say that like the written word is bad. It's just to say there are lots of other ways to communicate that are just as effective and just as powerful. They're just not the forms of communication that get centered. So this is a lot of ideas and concepts, and with a little bit of sort of like, what do we actually do, or some examples of what do we actually do with them. So we want to talk now just a little bit more about like, how do we engage with this and how do we stay engaged? The staying engaged piece is such a big question because we are inundated with story and statistic and fact about the suffering in our world as a result of these systems of power. And it's really hard to keep in contact with it and keep connected to what our individual role in the work is. Some of the places that are really important, places that are important for startings and places that we have to stay really connected to is around guilt and shame. Because guilt and shame are incredible interrupters to our steadfastness in this work. Because we get kind of overwhelmed, or we allow overwhelm to take us often through the channels of guilt and shame. And so how do they operate for us? And this is going to be different for each of us based on our sort of unique sort of overlap of identities and our unique locations in the world. That connects to how we stay engaged with things that are uncomfortable. And, as palliative care folks, like we've got good practice here. We've got good muscle here. Like we know how to sit with people when they're vomiting. We know how to sit with people in pain. Like we know how to sit with people when there aren't answers for some of the biggest pain points and tender life or death moments in their life. Like we can do it there, which means it's the same muscle. It's the same set of muscles. We can do it here. We can stay even when we feel unsure or we feel bad or we don't know the right next way to go. As we've been talking a little bit about staying engaged, engaging and staying engaged really means challenging sort of the tenets of education, right? We come from systems that love a didactic, which is mostly what we're doing here today. Slightly ironic. And we also know that's not how adults learn, but we still do it anyways, because we got to have an expert and I got to be an expert, or like, what does my career mean, right? Why is this the way? Why is this how we know that knowledge is good enough, or that we're doing a good enough job by one person having to be in charge of all the information and giving it like directly, but like why? Who decided that? And why do we continue to do it? Even when we know it's not the way that people learn, and it's not the way that we create communities of belonging and connectedness, which is how people change behavior, which is what, as palliative care folks, we want people to do. We want them to take what we say and change their behavior, change their attitude towards people who are ill, change their attitudes towards kids that are dying. another just important tenet of this is that like this work is everywhere, in everything that we do, in every relationship that we have. It's not something that we hold for work or for rallies or for, carved out practices or pieces of our life. Like we have the opportunity to be doing this work in every relationship, in every interpersonal encounter, through awareness and through a willingness to show up and actually learn about what's happening for somebody else and to be real about what's happening for us too. So much of this practice is about slowing down, right? Like, since George Floyd was murdered, everybody's got like a manager of DEI or a chief of DEI or everybody's got a DEI person, and the DEI person is charged with outcomes. Like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do by the end of this academic year? And like, outcomes are important. And like this work doesn't work on the academic year calendar, right? This is real change takes time. And it requires that we like slow down to a point that is really uncomfortable, right? Like, remember when you're learning how to get comfortable with silence and like how hard that was? It's like that, only like maybe on steroids, because it takes so much time to slow down and actually think like, wow, why did I say that? And where did it come from? And what does it mean that we think everyone should have an advanced care plan? Or what does it mean that we think everyone should have palliative care even, right? Like these kinds of interrogation or investigation take time because we have to challenge all of our defaults that come up as our answers to make sure that we're not just continuing on in the same vein. The going faster and the getting things done is a response is a response that's trying to drive us towards comfort again. So if we know that we hire 5 faculty of color by the end of 24-25, and we have diversified our faculty pool, we will have done the work, right? But that says nothing about whether or not they're there in 5 years and what we've done to the culture to make it safe for folks other than white people to feel comfortable in the work that we do, right? These are not short-term games. It's not to say that representation isn't desperately important. It is, but so is all of the work that makes diversity and representation sustainable over time. It's a really profound practice for me personally to resist urgency. And I have misstepped many a time when moving really quickly and feeling like I'm the one who has to do something about this one thing right now in this moment. Almost always things can tolerate more time to contemplate, to seek guidance and counsel, to collaborate on different answers together. And so can we just slow down? It might be one of your biggest takeaways today. Can we just slow down? Yeah, I'm starting, like my mouth is getting dry. This is really talking. Arka, you want to take this slide for me so I can drink water?
Absolutely. And I am going to talk just a little bit faster. I know it's the irony, right, of talking about slowing down and all of this, and then I'm like looking at the clock that's running up here on my screen, and we have like 8 minutes left, right? So I'm like, oh, I want to make sure that people have time to talk. So I'm just naming that irony and that own discomfort that I'm having right now. So, we need to understand that this work is relational, it's intimate. We have to sometimes, I think, force ourselves to remain grounded and engaged because depending on our identities, we can opt in or opt out of remaining engaged, right? And that we've said this, I don't know how many times we've said this over the last 50 or so minutes, that it's going to be uncomfortable. Every time I talk about this work, I feel anxious, right? Every single time I feel a pit in my stomach because I feel anxious about it. And yet I continue to remain engaged because I don't have the option of checking out. We have to operate with integrity, right? We have to remain honest and own our mistakes. And that comes back to the accountability piece. Do you want me to keep talking, Bridget?
Yeah, slash, I think we should get to them.
Yes, let's do it. All right. So, of course, relationships nourish community, accountability, and motivation, sustainability, and honesty, honesty with ourselves and with each other. And just some next steps that we've come up with for us as educators to take, right? And just for you all to think about, what is an action that you can take as an educator? What is one thing that you can educate yourself more about? Who are your partners as an educator? Bridget spoke to that earlier, right? Who else is sharing the stage with you? What commitments and intentions can you make to center anti-oppression work in your teaching? And with that, I am going to actually stop sharing my screen, maybe. There we go. So that we can have a few minutes of thought and reflection and comments from you all.
Like Arca said at the top, we usually have 4 hours for basically the same amount of content. With like ways woven through to have more conversation. So we get that it's a lot to make sense of or hear. Yeah, go see patients, Sharon.
Thank you, both of you so much for the time that you have taken to attempt to sort of crystallize some of the teaching that you have done over the years in this. And hopefully many of us are leaving with more questions than answers. That's sort of how I feel, and even articulating a question feels challenging. I think the urgency piece, I think what I'll label for myself, and curious if you all have thoughts about the tension between using the sense of urgency to take action, to move forward, even if that is a tiny step. Like that sense of urgency sort of helps me not be stuck in a place of spiraling and shame and guilt. And yet hearing that also it's a kind of there's a risk to that urgency. Feels like a spot where I feel a little bit stuck. I feel myself gripping that sense of urgency and not wanting to let it go.
Because we have to fix it now. We have to fix it right now. I feel that same sense of urgency, right? Or if you hear about something that happens, or you I'm make a mistake in teaching, right? Or in your educating, in the educating that you're doing, and like you want to hurry up and fix it and make it better, right? And to make it better, but sometimes what we have to do is we just have to sit in it, right? We can acknowledge, we can be accountable, and sometimes we just have to sit in it and resist that urgency.
Guess what your comment also makes me think is like, what are the other antidotes to guilt and shame? And or like, how do we go deeper into the guilt and shame, into like the sadness or the helplessness, or whatever for each of us might be under that, so that it's not such a defaulty place, right? Because like if it's really true that we all inherited these systems and we are all working together to undo them, like what is there to feel guilty about? And that's a provocative question. There's probably a lot, right? But it's like, it's so, shame and guilt are so consuming and so distracting. And so then, yes, we need something that like yanks us out of there so we don't get stuck. But is there another way out, or maybe through, so that it stops being a place that we go to? And instead, the place we go to is like, oh, there's deep grief here. I can tend to that grief about the way that the world is and about the way the world hurts particular people more than others. Like I can touch on that and catalyze that and then go to action versus the like popping in and out of grief and shame. That's a much bigger conversation. So I appreciate you bringing it and letting me just kind of like fumble around with it. But
As we're coming to the top of the hour, are there is there anybody else who wants to share a reflection? And if not, that's also fine. But want to make sure that we create that space to do that. Thank you, Becky.
thanks so much for being here with us. And hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Have a good rest of your days wherever you are in them.
Thank you again to Arika and Bridget for creating this space for us to think and slow down and sit with it. And thank you all for continuing to show up for Nipsey, and we'll keep trying to wade through this and other work. So appreciate y'all, and we'll see it again in a couple months.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.